You get to be my age of phone ringing. You get to be my age of phone ringing at 2 in the morning. Never brings good news. It usually means a heart attack, a car crash, or somebody passing away. But when I reached out in the dark and squinted at the glowing screen, my blood ran completely cold. The caller ID showed it was my adopted son, Leo, and he was not calling from his personal cell phone. He was calling on the encrypted secure line issued to him by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Cyber Division in Washington. I answered, my voice raspy and thick with sleep. Before I could even get the word hello out of my mouth, his voice cut through the silence. "Dad." "Listen to me very carefully," Leo said. His tone was not the warm, cheerful voice of the boy I raised. It was the deadly, serious, hollow tone of a federal agent in the middle of an active crisis. "Turn off your bedroom lamp. Right now. Do not turn on any other lights in the house. I need you to get out of bed, walk as silently as you can, and go straight down to the basement." I froze. The sudden chill of the autumn night bit at my skin. "Leo, what on earth is going on?" I whispered back, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. "You are making me worried. Are we in danger?" "Dad, there is absolutely no time to explain," he snapped, his voice tight with panic. "Just do exactly what I say. Get to the basement, lock the heavy door behind you, and listen to me very closely. Whatever you do, do not wake up Derek. Do not let your son-in-law know that you are awake. If you are watching this story right now, I need you to take a deep breath. Please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what city or state you are listening from. Because the nightmare that unfolded in my own home under the very roof I built with my bare hands is something I would not wish on my worst enemy. I need to know you are with me on this, because what I am about to tell you will make you question the motives of everyone around you." I hung up the phone. I did exactly what my son ordered. I slid out from under the heavy quilt. My knees and lower back ached with a familiar dull pain. It is a permanent reminder of the 40 years I spent pouring concrete, framing steel, and reading blueprints as a construction engineer. My hands are heavily calloused, permanently scarred from decades of back-breaking labor. I broke my body to provide a perfect life for my family. I worked double shifts to pay for my daughter Sarah to go to the best schools, and I poured my life savings into building this custom home on a quiet, isolated 2-acre plot surrounded by woods. It was supposed to be my peaceful retirement sanctuary. Now I was sneaking through it like a thief in the night. Because I built this house from the ground up, I knew its anatomy better than anyone. I knew exactly which floorboards groaned and which ones were silent. I crept down the hallway, keeping my breathing shallow. I passed the master guest bedroom where my daughter Sarah and her husband Derek slept. The door was slightly ajar. I paused for a fraction of a second, straining my ears. I could hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of my daughter, but I did not hear the heavier, deeper snoring of my son-in-law. Derek was not in bed. A sick feeling twisted in my stomach. I continued down the hall, slipping through the kitchen and quietly opening the heavy wooden door that led to the basement stairs. I descended into the darkness, my hand sliding along the cold, concrete wall for balance. This was not just an ordinary basement. Years ago, living out in the country, I decided to over-engineer the foundation. I reinforced the walls with industrial rebar and poured extra thick concrete. I even installed shatterproof, bullet-resistant glass on the small basement hopper windows, just in case we ever faced severe storms or intruders. It was basically a fortified bunker disguised as a storage room. I reached the bottom of the stairs and quietly slid the heavy steel deadbolt into place. The basement was pitch black and freezing. I walked over to the small reinforced window that looked out over the front driveway. I wiped the condensation off the glass and peered out into the darkness. What I saw in that driveway froze the breath in my lungs and shattered my heart into a million pieces. 3 massive black sports utility vehicles were slowly rolling up my long gravel driveway. Their headlights were completely turned off. They moved like silent predators in the moonlight, parking in a tight formation right in front of my porch. The doors opened in unison. 4 men stepped out into the cold night air. They were dressed entirely in black tactical gear. Even from this distance, I could clearly see the long, dark shapes of silenced weapons resting against their chests. But that was not the part that made my stomach heave. One of the men went to the trunk of the last vehicle and pulled out 3 large, heavy-duty medical-grade body bags. The thick plastic unrolled onto the gravel with a muted thud. They were not here to rob me. They were here to erase me. And then the front door of my house slowly opened. A figure stepped out onto the porch, illuminated briefly by the pale moonlight. It was Derek, my son-in-law, the man I had welcomed into my home, the man I had trusted to protect my only daughter. He was fully dressed. He calmly walked down the porch steps and raised his hand, greeting the armed men with a casual nod. He pointed directly toward the window of my upstairs bedroom, giving them the signal. He was the one who invited them in. He was the one who orchestrated this hit. I stood there in the freezing darkness of my basement, my calloused hands trembling against the cold concrete wall. The betrayal hit me harder than any physical blow I had ever taken in my 78 years of life. I had fed this man. I had housed him. I had treated him like a son. And now he was standing in my driveway, handing me over to a hit squad. How did we get here? How did my quiet, peaceful retirement turn into a deadly trap? To understand the sheer magnitude of Derek's betrayal and the horrifying secret he was hiding in my own house, you have to understand what happened exactly 72 hours earlier. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 days before the terrifying nightmare in my front driveway. I was sitting quietly on my favorite wooden kitchen stool, sipping a fresh cup of black coffee and reading the local news on my digital tablet. It was supposed to be just another peaceful, quiet day in my retirement. But then the overhead lights in the kitchen suddenly flickered. The heavy overhead LED bulbs dimmed completely, stayed dark for 3 long seconds, and then surged back to life with a faint humming sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. As an old construction engineer, I know how electrical grids operate. I wired this entire property myself with commercial-grade cables. A house like mine does not experience random power surges on a clear morning unless something is drawing an immense amount of raw electricity. I walked to the utility closet and opened the breaker panel. The main switch was warm to the touch. That was the first red flag. Something was pulling a constant heavy current right on the edge of tripping the safety switch. I went back into the kitchen. My tablet screen suddenly displayed a connection error. The home network had completely dropped. The internet router in the living room was resetting its little green indicator lights, flashing frantically in the shadows. This exact thing had been happening for an entire week, but I foolishly brushed it off. Now my sharp gut feeling was screaming that something was very wrong. I walked down the hallway toward the attached garage. As I reached the heavy fireproof door, I noticed a strange, deep humming vibration coming through the floorboards. It sounded like a massive industrial exhaust fan. I turned the brass doorknob. It was locked from the other side. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my master key, and slid it into the keyhole. It would not turn. Someone had completely changed the deadbolt lock on my own garage. Before I could process the disrespect, I heard footsteps. Derek was walking down the hallway wearing a custom-tailored navy blue suit that cost over $2,000. He held an expensive leather briefcase in his right hand. When Sarah brought Derek home 3 years ago, he was a struggling financial analyst drowning in massive debt. I gladly paid his loans. I let them move into my home rent-free so they could save up for a place of their own. I fed him and I treated him like a son. And this was the respect I received in return from him. "Good morning, Thomas," he said, flashing a rehearsed smile. "Is there a problem with the door?" "Derek," I said, keeping my voice firm. "Why is the lock changed on my garage? And what is that loud humming noise? The main breaker is running hot, and the power just surged." Derek did not flinch. "Oh, I meant to tell you," he said smoothly. "I had a contractor upgrade the lock yesterday. I am running a few high-end data servers in there for my investment firm. We use artificial intelligence to crunch market numbers. You set up commercial servers in my residential garage without asking." "Thomas, it is perfectly safe," he replied dismissively. "I bought specialized fans to keep the temperature down. The AI needs constant power. But here's the best part. I am running a dedicated portfolio for your retirement fund. Once this AI hits the right algorithm, I will double your savings in 6 months. Think of it as my way of paying you back." It was the perfect plausible lie. He wrapped his intrusion in a promise of wealth. But my engineering brain knew a few AI servers do not heat up a commercial breaker panel. A bedroom door opened down the hall. My daughter Sarah stepped out, tying her silk robe. She walked over to Derek and wrapped her arms around his waist. "What are you two arguing about so early?" she asked. "We are not arguing, sweetheart," Derek said, kissing her forehead. "I was just explaining to Thomas about the investment servers in the garage. He was worried about the power flickering." Sarah looked at me with a defensive scowl. "Dad, please do not start a fight today. Derek is working so hard on this project. He stays up until 3 in the morning to build a future for us. You always say you want him to be successful, but whenever he takes initiative, you question him." Her words felt like a slap. Sarah was my flesh and blood. I sacrificed my youth to give her every advantage. Yet she was blindly defending a man who was lying. The devotion in her eyes made me sick, but it tied my hands. If I pushed too hard without proof, I would be the villain trying to sabotage his son-in-law. I took a deep breath, forcing my shoulders to relax. "Fine," I said quietly. "But if that equipment trips my main breaker and causes a fire, I am throwing it out on the lawn. Do you understand me?" Derek smiled again, that same hollow, arrogant smirk. "Crystal clear, Thomas. Have a great day." He kissed Sarah and walked out the front door. I watched through the window as he drove away in his luxury sedan, a car my money helped buy. I poured coffee down the sink. The power flickered again. Derek thought he had won. He thought I was an ignorant old man who did not understand modern technology. He thought his smooth words and fancy suits could blind me to the truth. But he made one critical mistake. He forgot that I built this house from the dirt up. I knew every hidden space within these walls, and I knew for a fact he was lying. That afternoon, the bank would call me and the real nightmare would begin. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times, its heavy brass pendulum swinging back and forth in the quiet house. I was alone again. The silence should have been comforting, but instead it felt heavy and suffocating. I sat at the kitchen island, staring at the cold dregs of my coffee, turning his words over and over in my mind. Artificial intelligence, dedicated portfolio, doubling my retirement. It all sounded like a rehearsed sales pitch from a desperate man. And desperation was absolutely something I clearly recognized all too well in my arrogant son-in-law right now. When Sarah first brought Derek to this house 3 years ago, he was a broken man hiding behind a cheap suit. He claimed to be an ambitious financial advisor waiting for his big break, but the reality was far less glamorous. He was drowning in massive high-interest debt. His credit score was in the gutter, and his car was weeks away from being repossessed. I saw right through his completely fake facade. But Sarah looked at him with such blind adoration. She had always been a romantic, a girl who believed she could fix broken wings forever without fail. I wanted to protect her, so I did what any father would do. I opened my wallet. I paid off his car. I cleared his credit card debts. I let them move into the guest suite so they could save money to buy their own home. I thought I was giving them a head start. But giving a man like Derek a free ride does not make him grateful. It makes him entitled. Over 3 years, that temporary stay turned into permanent residency. The grateful young man morphed into a condescending houseguest who acted like he owned absolutely everything inside. Sarah defended his every move, dismissing my valid concerns as the paranoia of an old man who did not understand the modern world. I walked over to the kitchen window and looked out at the sprawling backyard. I had worked too hard to let a grifter treat me like a fool in my own home. I grabbed my tablet again, determined to figure out exactly what was draining my electricity supply today. The network name had completely vanished from the available list entirely. It was not just a glitch. Something was actively blocking the signal permanently right then and there. I decided to walk around the exterior of the house, hoping to get a look inside the garage from the small side window. The autumn air was cold and crisp as I stepped onto the back patio. I navigated carefully around the old rose bushes, moving toward the side of the garage. The small window was positioned high up on the wall. I dragged a heavy wooden crate over and carefully stepped onto it. My old knees popped loudly in protest, but I ignored the sharp pain. I peered through the dirty glass surface, cupping my hands to block glare. What I saw inside made my blood completely boil. Thick power cables were snaking across the concrete floor, plugging into an absolute wall of massive computer towers stacked on industrial metal racks. There were dozens of them humming furiously. Large exhaust pipes had been illegally cut into the drywall, venting intense heat out through the roof. This was not a small project. This was a commercial-grade operation installed illegally on my property. And worse, it was hooked directly into my residential power grid. The sheer arrogance of it was staggering. I stepped down from the heavy crate very slowly. My chest tightened with a toxic mixture of rage and genuine fear. If the city inspectors saw this mess, I could be fined thousands of dollars, or worse, the house could catch fire. I went back inside my mind, racing with 100 different ways to confront him when he got home. I was ready to pack his bags myself and leave them on the front porch. But before I could take another step, the landline phone mounted on the kitchen wall began to ring. It was a sharp, piercing sound that shattered the tense silence completely right away then. Most people do not use landlines anymore, but I kept mine active for extreme emergencies. I walked over and looked at the digital caller ID display screen. It read the name of my primary bank, the institution where I had safely kept my life savings and my mortgage for the past 30 years. I picked up the receiver, pressing it tightly against my ear. "Hello, Thomas Caldwell speaking," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the adrenaline still pumping through my old veins. "Good afternoon, Mr. Caldwell," a very polite female voice responded immediately on the line today. "This is the lending department at the bank. We are calling to verify a few important details regarding your recent application." I frowned, my grip on the phone tightening. "What application?" I asked, pure confusion momentarily replacing my intense anger. "I have not applied for anything recently. My accounts are completely settled, and my mortgage was fully paid off 12 years ago." There was a very long, unsettling pause on the other end of the line then. I could hear the faint sound of a computer keyboard clacking loudly. "Mr. Caldwell," the representative said, her tone suddenly shifting heavily now. "I am looking at an application submitted online yesterday afternoon for a loan. It is an application for a second mortgage on your primary residence. The request is for a cash-out refinance in the amount of $450,000. The documents included your social security number, your digital signature, and a designated routing number for the funds to be deposited." The floor seemed to drop out from beneath me immediately. The kitchen walls spun for a fraction of a second as the sheer magnitude of her words crashed over me. $450,000. $450,000. The words echoed in my mind like a physical blow to the chest. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter just to keep myself upright. "Miss," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of shock and rising fury, "I did not authorize any such transaction. I own this house free and clear. I have not signed a single piece of paper, digital or otherwise, requesting a second mortgage. You need to freeze that application immediately and flag it as absolute fraud." I could hear the immediate shift in her breathing. She started typing rapidly. I am stopping the process right now, Mr. Caldwell. I will place a hard lock on your entire profile. However, I must inform you that the application was submitted from the primary Internet Protocol address registered to your home. It also utilized your correct Social Security number and answered all of your personal security questions flawlessly. Someone inside your house initiated this request. I thanked her, my throat suddenly very dry, and hung up the phone. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. My own flesh and blood, or the man sleeping in her bed, had just tried to steal nearly $500,000 of my hard-earned equity. They were trying to pull the rug right out from under my feet, while smiling in my face. I looked down the hallway toward the master guest suite. Derek was gone for the day, supposedly working at his firm, but Sarah was still home. I marched down the hallway, my heavy footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors. I did not bother knocking gently. I pushed the door open. Sarah was sitting on the edge of the bed folding laundry. She looked up, startled by my sudden entrance. "Dad, what is wrong?" she asked, dropping a folded shirt. "You look completely pale. Are you having another dizzy spell?" I stepped into the room, my hands balled into tight fists at my sides. "Do not try to change the subject, Sarah. The bank just called me. Someone submitted an application for a cash-out refinance on this house. A second mortgage for $450,000. Did Derek do this?" I expected her to look shocked. I expected her to gasp, to deny it, to tell me there must be some terrible mistake or that someone had stolen our identities. Instead, her face completely crumbled. Her eyes welled up with tears, and she covered her mouth with trembling hands. "Dad, please," she sobbed, standing up and taking a step toward me. "Let me explain. It is not what you think it is." I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. "You knew about this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You helped him forge my signature to steal my house." "No, Dad." "No," she cried out, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It was never about stealing. It was just a pre-approval application. We were never going to actually take the money without talking to you first. We were just trying to see what your options were because we were terrified. Terrified of what I demanded, stepping back as she tried to reach for my arm. Of the fact that you might outlive his fake financial schemes." She shook her head frantically. "No, Dad. Do you not remember what happened last month? You collapsed in the garden. You fainted and hit your head on the stone planter. The doctors said it was just dehydration and exhaustion, but Derek and I were absolutely paralyzed with fear. We realized that if you had a stroke or if you needed emergency surgery or long-term assisted care, we have no liquid cash to pay for it. The house is your only major asset. Derek said we should get the paperwork ready for a medical safety net, just in case something tragic happened. He said it would take weeks to process a loan if it was a real emergency. We were just trying to protect you." She collapsed onto the bed, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The tears seemed so genuine. The fear in her voice echoed the exact terror I had seen in her eyes the day the ambulance came to the house last month. For a brief, agonizing moment, my fatherly instincts kicked in. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that my little girl was just acting out of a desperate, misguided sense of love and worry. I looked at her shaking shoulders. It made sense on the surface. A medical crisis in this country can bankrupt a family in a matter of days. A pre-approval for an emergency line of credit was a logical, if deeply flawed, precaution. I let out a long, heavy sigh and walked over to her. I placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, you cannot do things like this behind my back," I said softly. "It is a federal crime to forge a signature. If you were worried about medical bills, you should have just talked to me. I have separate insurance policies you do not even know about. I will handle my own health. Tell Derek to cancel whatever else he is planning immediately." She looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy, and nodded eagerly. "I promise, Dad. We will cancel it. I am so sorry we overstepped. We just love you so much." I gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze and walked out of the room. But the moment I stepped into the cold, empty hallway, the warmth of her tears vanished. My face hardened as I walked back to the kitchen. Her lie calmed the storm, but my gut was screaming. $450,000 is no medical safety net. That massive amount is an absolute exit strategy. Derek was preparing to completely liquidate my assets. I needed to find the real truth now. That evening, the sun dipped below the tree line, casting sinister shadows across the hardwood floors of my living room. I sat in my worn leather recliner holding a book I was not reading. The tension inside my chest was wound so tight I felt like a coiled spring. I was playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse in my own home, maintaining the illusion of a gullible old man. When Derek returned from his supposed office, he walked through the door with the effortless confidence of a man holding the winning cards. He hung his expensive wool coat, loosened his silk tie, and greeted Sarah with a lingering kiss. Watching him play the devoted husband made my stomach churn. At dinner, the atmosphere was suffocating. Sarah hid her swollen eyes behind makeup, practically tripping over herself to serve his favorite roast beef. Derek was in high spirits, talking endlessly about market trends and the bright future he was building. He looked into my eyes, asking if my afternoon had been restful. I forced my facial muscles to relax. I smiled back, telling him I took a long nap and felt perfectly fine. I needed him to believe his secrets were safe. After eating, we migrated to the living room. The fireplace was crackling, throwing a warm orange glow across the room. My loyal golden retriever, a gentle 7-year-old boy named Rusty, was sleeping near the hearth. Rusty had been my constant companion since my wife passed away. He was an intuitive dog, able to read a room better than most humans. Usually Rusty loved Derek. Derek would always toss him table scraps or scratch behind his ears. But tonight was different. Derek reached into the pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a bone-shaped dog biscuit. He walked to the fireplace, crouching to Rusty's level. "Here you go, buddy." Derek coaxed, his voice dripping with unnatural sweetness. "I brought you a special treat from that expensive pet bakery downtown." Rusty lifted his heavy golden head. He sniffed the air, his nose twitching, as Derek extended the biscuit on his flat palm. Instead of eagerly snatching the treat, Rusty froze. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He let out a low whine and scrambled backward, his paws slipping on the polished wood floor. Rusty actively retreated, moving quickly to hide behind my recliner, pressing his warm body against my legs. He let out another whimper tail, tucked firmly between his hind legs. Derek let out a hollow laugh, pulling his hand back and tossing the biscuit onto the coffee table. "Well, suit yourself, you ungrateful mutt," he muttered under his breath, though his eyes lacked real amusement. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Animals possess a raw, unfiltered sixth sense. They can smell fear, and they can certainly smell poison. I stared at the biscuit resting on the glass table, my mind racing through terrifying possibilities. Before I could process the implication of the dog's reaction, Derek turned his attention directly to me. He walked into the kitchen. I heard the faint clinking of porcelain mugs and boiling water pouring from the kettle. Minutes later, he returned to the living room, carrying a steaming ceramic cup on a small saucer. He walked over and placed it gently on the side table right next to my elbow. "I made this just for you, Thomas," Derek said, looking down with an expression of deep manufactured concern. "Sarah told me you were asking about the mortgage earlier, and that you seemed stressed out. She also mentioned you had a little dizzy spell again. I figured you could use something to calm your nerves. It is a special herbal tea blend imported from overseas. Valerian root chamomile and a few natural ingredients, guaranteed to help you sleep deeply through the night. Drink it while it is hot. It works wonders, I promise." I looked down at the dark, fragrant liquid steaming in the cup. The smell was earthy and overwhelmingly strong, pungent enough to mask the bitter taste of chemical additives. My heart began to pound against my ribs. The pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped together in my mind with terrifying clarity. The illegal commercial servers in my garage, The fraudulent loan application for nearly $500,000 frozen today. And now my desperate son-in-law pushing a suspicious beverage into my hands right before bedtime, just moments after my dog refused his food. He did not just want to sedate me. He needed me incapacitated. If the bank required verbal confirmation for the loan tomorrow, or if he needed my thumbprint on a physical document, a heavily drugged old man would be the perfect victim. Or perhaps his plan was much darker. A 78-year-old man passing away peacefully in his sleep from sudden heart failure would not raise questions, especially with a history of fainting spells. Derek stood there, hands tucked casually into his pockets, waiting for me to take a sip. His eyes were entirely dead, devoid of human empathy. He watched me the way a butcher watches a calf. If I refused the tea outright, I would force his hand. If I confronted him without concrete proof of what was on those servers, he would simply deny it, and I might not survive the night. I had to play the part of the unsuspecting father-in-law perfectly. I let out a tired sigh and offered him a weak, grateful smile. "Thank you, Derek," I said, my voice trembling slightly to sell the performance. "It has been a long, exhausting day. I appreciate you looking after my health. I will let it cool down for a minute and drink it all before bed." Derek gave a satisfied nod, his ego accepting my submission. "Sleep well, Thomas," he replied smoothly, turning on his heel and confidently walking toward the dark hallway to join my daughter. The moment his footsteps faded down the hallway and the distant door of the master suite clicked shut, my entire demeanor shifted. I did not waste a single second. I stood up from my recliner, my joints aching in protest, and carefully picked up the steaming ceramic mug from the side table. I walked silently over to the large potted ficus plant resting in the corner of the living room by the front window. With a steady hand, I slowly poured the dark, pungent liquid into the soil, making sure it soaked deep into the roots so it would not leave a suspicious puddle on the surface. I left just a tiny drop at the bottom of the mug, enough to make it look like I had eagerly swallowed every last drop of his toxic concoction. I placed the empty cup back on the side table exactly where he had left it. I turned off the living room lamps, plunging the house into heavy darkness, and made my way to my bedroom on the ground floor. I changed into dark clothing, putting on a pair of soft-soled slippers that would muffle my footsteps against the hardwood. Then I climbed into bed and pulled the heavy quilt up to my chin. And I waited. Lying in the dark, pretending to be asleep, is a profound psychological torture. Every minute feels like an hour. My bedroom was completely silent, except for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. I focused on controlling my breathing, drawing deep, slow breaths in through my nose and letting them out softly through my mouth. I had to lower my heart rate. I had to become a statue. I knew Derek would not simply trust that the tea had done its job. A man who plots to steal $500,000 and installs illegal commercial servers in the home of another person does not leave things to chance. He would come to verify his work. The hours dragged on. Midnight came and went. The house settled, the wooden frame groaning gently against the cold autumn wind outside. My eyelids grew heavy, the natural exhaustion of a 78-year-old man trying to claim me, but pure adrenaline kept my mind sharp. Finally, at exactly 2 hours past the midnight hour, the brass handle of my bedroom door slowly began to turn. The faint squeak of the hinges sounded like a gunshot in the dead silence. I immediately let my jaw go slack and deepened my breathing, mimicking the heavy, even snores of a man in a deep, chemically induced slumber. Soft footsteps crossed the threshold. The floorboards near the foot of my bed creaked under his weight. I kept my eyes completely shut, but I could feel his presence looming over me. The smell of expensive cologne and faint sweat hit my nose. Derek stood right beside my bed for what felt like an eternity. He was studying me, listening to my breathing pattern. Then I felt a sudden sharp poke on my right shoulder. It was not a gentle nudge to wake me. It was a firm, testing jab. I did not flinch. I let my body roll slightly with the motion remaining perfectly limp. My breathing never hitched. I was a dead weight. A few seconds later, I heard him let out a soft, arrogant chuckle. "Sleep tight, old man," he whispered into the darkness. His footsteps retreated and the bedroom door clicked shut once more. I waited exactly 15 minutes to ensure he was securely back in his own bed. When I finally opened my eyes, the charade was over. The hunted old man was gone. I threw off the heavy quilt and sat up on the edge of the mattress. My blood was boiling, but my mind was icy and clear. I walked over to the back of my closet, reaching past my old winter coats, and pulled out a small, dusty metal toolbox. Inside was a collection of specialized tools I had acquired decades ago during my time managing large-scale construction sites. Sometimes contractors lost keys to supply sheds and waiting for a locksmith cost time and money. I had learned to bypass commercial locks long before Derek was even born. I selected a thin, hardened steel tension wrench and a standard hook pick, slipping them silently into the pocket of my dark trousers. I stepped out of my bedroom, becoming a ghost in my own home. I knew every single creak and groan of this house. I stepped lightly on the edges of the floorboards where the joists offered the most support, moving down the hallway with practiced precision. The humming vibration grew stronger as I approached the heavy fireproof door that led to the garage. I stopped in front of it, pressing my ear against the cold wood. The mechanical roar of the exhaust fans was much louder now in the dead of night. Derek felt so secure in his little empire that he had not bothered to install an alarm on this interior door. He simply relied on the heavy-duty commercial deadbolt he had installed yesterday. I pulled the small flashlight from my pocket and gripped it between my teeth, aiming the narrow beam of light directly at the brass keyhole. I slid the tension wrench into the bottom of the cylinder, applying just a fraction of pressure with my left thumb. With my right hand, I inserted the hook pick, feeling for the individual pins inside the mechanism. One by one, I applied upward pressure, feeling the tiny brass pins click into place above the shear line. My hands were old, covered in thick scars and liver spots, but the muscle memory remained flawless. Click, click, click. The final pin surrendered with a soft, metallic snap. The tension wrench turned freely, disengaging the heavy locking mechanism. I reached up, grasped the doorknob, and slowly pushed the fireproof door open to uncover the truth. A blast of freezing air hit me square in the face the moment the heavy fireproof door swung open. It was exactly like stepping into an industrial meat locker. The familiar smell of motor oil from my garage had been completely erased, replaced by the sharp metallic scent of ozone and overworked electronics. I stepped over the threshold and carefully pulled the door shut behind me. I stood there in the cold darkness for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the strange, eerie glow. The space where I used to park my truck was completely transformed. Floor-to-ceiling solid metal racks dominated the entire room. They were packed with dozens of sleek black computer servers, their front panels illuminated by rows of rapidly blinking blue and green lights. Thick bundles of black Ethernet cables snaked along the cold concrete floor, feeding into heavy-duty routers bolted to the walls. In the ceiling, 2 massive commercial exhaust fans had been roughly cut directly into my drywall, sucking the intense heat generated by the machines outside into the night. Portable industrial air conditioning units were constantly blasting freezing cold air directly onto the hot server racks. The noise was deafening. It was a constant roar that vibrated right through the soles of my shoes. Derek had told me these were artificial intelligence servers designed to analyze stock market trends for my retirement. But I am an old engineer. I aimed the narrow beam of my flashlight at the casing. These were not standard enterprise servers running data analysis. The architecture was entirely wrong. They were clustered in parallel arrays specifically optimized for heavy cryptographic hashing. These machines were designed for one purpose only. They were mining cryptocurrency and routing heavily encrypted data packages across decentralized networks. My chest tightened as the sheer scale of his operation became clear. This heavy equipment alone was easily worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. A struggling financial analyst with bad credit could never afford this kind of expensive hardware. Someone very dangerous was funding this entire operation in the shadows. I moved past the towering racks, keeping my flashlight aimed low. In the far back corner of the garage, tucked behind a wall of cooling units, I spotted my old wooden workbench. It was completely desecrated by a massive dual-monitor computer workstation setup. The screens were locked in sleep mode, but the green power light on the tower was glowing steadily. Next to the keyboard sat a very heavy steel lockbox. I walked over to the workbench and examined the box. It was secured by a heavy brass padlock. Derek assumed the locked fireproof garage door was enough security to keep a naive old man away from his secrets. I pulled out my tension wrench and lockpicks again. My fingers were stiff from the freezing air blasting from the air conditioners, but my focus was absolute. I slid the tools into the padlock. Within exactly 30 seconds, the heavy lock popped open. I lifted the lid of the steel box. Inside, resting on a bed of dark foam, were 5 metallic USB-style flash drives. I recognized them immediately. They were encrypted hardware wallets used to store millions of dollars in untraceable cryptocurrency offline. Beside them lay a thick black leather-bound personal notebook. I picked up the notebook and opened it. My flashlight illuminated pages filled with handwritten notes, account numbers, and complex alphanumeric passwords. But the names at the top of the pages made my stomach drop. There were lists of offshore shell companies registered in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. Next to these company names were staggering figures. Transfers of $200,000, $500,000, and even massive transactions crossing the $1 million mark. I flipped to the next page and saw my own name staring back. Thomas Caldwell. Beneath my name was my social security number, my date of birth, and the exact address of this property. Derek had set up the primary shell company operating this server farm under my identity. Every piece of illicit data passing through these machines and every digital dollar laundered through this network was legally tied to me. If authorities raided this house right now, they would look at the homeowner on the official paperwork. He was setting me up to take the fall for a massive federal crime. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my mobile phone. I knew my home network was compromised, so I made sure the phone was in airplane mode to prevent any automatic cloud syncing over his internet. I opened the camera application and began taking rapid, clear photographs of everything. I photographed the hardware wallets. I photographed every single page of the black ledger, making sure the account numbers and shell company names were perfectly legible. I took close-up pictures of the service tags and IP addresses printed on the side of the server racks. I desperately needed absolute, irrefutable proof. The camera shutter clicked silently in the roaring room, capturing the digital footprint of his betrayal. My hands were shaking, not from the freezing temperature, but from the unadulterated rage coursing through my veins. The man sleeping down the hall was not just a greedy opportunist trying to steal my home equity. He was a completely ruthless criminal operating a money-laundering syndicate right under my roof. After photographing the evidence, I closed the ledger and placed it where I found it. I positioned the wallets back in their cutouts. I closed the lid and snapped the padlock into place, wiping it with my sleeve to remove any fingerprints. I turned off my flashlight and navigated through the maze of screaming servers back to the fireproof door. I slipped back into the quiet hallway, carefully engaging the deadbolt lock behind me, so Derek would never suspect I had breached his sanctuary. I stood in the dark corridor, my heart hammering against my ribs. I needed my adopted son, but I could not use my personal cell phone or the landline to contact him. Derek had complete control over the local network. He was actively monitoring the internet traffic, which meant any call, text, or email sent from within the house could be intercepted and read. I crept back into my bedroom, quietly retrieving a thick wool sweater and my heavy work boots. I bypassed the front door, knowing the deadbolt was loud, and instead slipped out through the sliding glass door in the sunroom. The crisp autumn air hit my face, shocking my system with a sudden rush of pure adrenaline. I walked carefully across the frost-covered grass, actively avoiding the gravel driveway, where my heavy footsteps would crunch and echo loudly into the silent night. My old dependable pickup truck was parked near the back shed, positioned far enough away from the master bedroom window. I climbed into the cab, closing the door softly, without letting the metal latch click all the way shut. I put the silver key into the ignition, holding my breath as the engine roared to life. I did not turn on the headlights until I was half a mile down the dark country road. The drive into town was a tense blur of towering pine trees and empty dark pavement. My mind was racing rapidly through 1,000 different horrific scenarios. I needed to get in touch with Leo, my boy, who had grown up to become a federal agent in the cyber division. I pulled into a brightly lit 24-hour gas station, sitting entirely isolated at the intersection of two major state highways. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I walked inside. The tired young cashier barely looked up from his magazine as I moved purposefully toward the small electronics display located near the back aisle. I grabbed a cheap prepaid smartphone and a data card right off the rack. I paid in cash, handing the young man 3 crisp $50 bills, and walked briskly back out to the cold cab of my truck. I locked the doors immediately and turned on the dim overhead dome light. My thick, calloused fingers fumbled slightly as I tore open the tough plastic packaging and inserted the small prepaid chip into the cheap plastic phone. It took 2 agonizingly slow minutes for the new device to boot up and properly register on the local cellular network. Once the solid signal bars appeared on the screen, I quickly enabled the secure wireless hotspot feature. I pulled my personal phone from my jacket pocket, keeping it securely in airplane mode, and connected it directly to the newly established burner phone hotspot. I was now operating on a clean, completely untraceable cellular network, successfully bypassing the poisoned internet router sitting back in my living room. I opened my encrypted messaging application and quickly typed in a special phone number I had memorized many years ago. It was Leo's direct, secure emergency line at the Federal Bureau headquarters located in Washington. The phone rang twice before a deep, highly alert voice answered on the other end. "Agent Caldwell, state your emergency," Leo said smoothly and professionally. "Leo, it is your father," I said, my voice cracking slightly under the immense, crushing weight of the terrible situation. "I need your help right now, and I need you to listen to me very carefully without interrupting for any reason at all." "Dad," Leo responded immediately, his professional tone shifting instantly into deep personal concern. "It is the middle of the night. What is wrong? Are you hurt? Do I need to send local police units to the house right now?" "No, do not send anyone," I ordered firmly and desperately. "If you send local squad cars, we are both as good as dead. Derek has completely taken over my garage." I took a deep breath, staring blankly out through the foggy windshield of my truck into the completely empty parking lot. He told us he was running financial artificial intelligence servers to help double my retirement fund. But I just picked the lock while he was sleeping. It is a massive commercial-grade server farm. The machines are exclusively configured for heavy cryptographic hashing. I found a heavy steel lockbox hidden on my old wooden workbench. Inside, there were 5 encrypted hardware wallets and a physical written ledger filled with offshore shell companies. And Leo, the absolute worst part is that the primary shell company operating the entire illicit network is legally registered under my name, my address, and my personal social security number. The line went dead silent for a few agonizing seconds. I could clearly hear the rapid, faint sound of a mechanical keyboard clacking in the background as Leo immediately moved to his dedicated computer terminal. "Dad, I am sending you a secure, highly encrypted digital drop link right now," Leo said, his voice dropping an octave into pure, focused federal tension. "I need you to upload absolutely everything you have on that device. Do not leave out a single minor detail." I opened the specific link he texted to the new burner phone and carefully selected the 32 high-resolution photographs I had just taken inside the freezing garage. I watched the digital progress bar slowly fill as the clear images of the handwritten ledgers, the metallic hardware wallets, and the unique server identification tags transmitted securely through the dark night air. The data transfer finally finished with a soft digital chime. Got them. Leo confirmed, his heavy keyboard typing speeding up into a frantic, rhythmic pace. I am running the server internet protocol addresses and the shell company names through the federal criminal database right now. Give me 2 minutes to trace the routing numbers and find out exactly who he is really working for. Stay inside your truck. Do not hang up. I sat inside the freezing cab of my old pickup truck, the cheap plastic burner phone pressed tightly against my ear. The digital clock on the dashboard glowed a faint, ghostly green in the dark. It read 3:15 in the morning. Every single second that ticked by felt like an absolute eternity. The heater in my truck was completely broken, and the bitter autumn cold was slowly seeping through my thick wool sweater, settling deep into my old bones. I could hear the faint, rapid clicking of Leo typing furiously on his mechanical keyboard all the way in Washington. He was searching through highly classified federal databases, tracing the digital breadcrumbs I had just sent him from my own garage. The silence on the phone was suffocating. I stared blankly at the flickering fluorescent lights of the empty gas station across the parking lot, my mind spinning violently. I had spent 40 years building a quiet, honest life. I poured concrete, I framed houses, and I raised my family with strong moral values. I had always believed that if you worked hard and treated people with respect, you would be safe. But the man sleeping in my house, the man who married my only daughter, had brought a lethal infection right into our sanctuary. The rapid typing on the other end of the line suddenly stopped. I heard a sharp, heavy intake of breath. Dad, Leo said. His voice was completely different now. The professional, authoritative tone of a seasoned federal agent was completely gone. Instead, his voice was trembling. It was shaking with a raw, unfiltered terror that I had never heard from him before, not even when he was a frightened little boy. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my knuckles turning completely white. "What is it, Leo?" I asked, my own voice sounding remarkably calm despite the storm raging inside my chest. "Talk to me. Tell me exactly what we are dealing with here." Leo let out a long, ragged exhale that sounded perfectly clear over the encrypted cellular connection. "Dad," he began, speaking very slowly, as if he could barely believe the words coming out of his own mouth. "The internet protocol addresses you photographed from those machines, and the routing numbers from that handwritten black ledger. I just ran them through our highest security clearance database at the Bureau. Those servers are not just mining standard cryptocurrency. They are acting as a massive, decentralized money laundering node. They are taking millions of dollars in illicit street cash, scrambling it through thousands of complex digital microtransactions, and spitting it out as completely clean, untraceable digital assets." I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of intense nausea wash over me. I knew Derek was stealing from me, but this was a completely different level of criminality. "And the people pumping that dirty money into your garage?" Leo continued, his voice dropping into a harsh, frantic whisper. "They are not just some local street gang or small-time scammers. The ledger you photographed connects directly to the digital wallets of the Sinaloa cartel." The words hit me right in the chest like a heavy sledgehammer. The Sinaloa cartel. Even an old construction engineer like me knows exactly who those people are. They are a ruthless, bloodthirsty syndicate. They are absolute ghosts who leave a trail of complete devastation, violence, and tragedy wherever they operate. And my arrogant, greedy son-in-law had invited their digital operations right into the home where I sleep every single night. "Derek is running a primary cleaning hub for their entire North American network," Leo explained, his words spilling out rapidly now. "The massive amount of electricity that hardware is pulling makes total sense. They are processing up to $5 million a week through those screaming machines in your garage." I leaned my forehead against the freezing glass of the driver's side window. The sheer magnitude of the danger was almost impossible to process. But Dad, Leo said, his voice cracking with genuine panic. "That is not even the worst part of this nightmare." I opened my eyes and stared out into the dark night. How could it possibly get any worse than a violent international cartel operating a multi-million-dollar laundering node out of my house? Because of the way he legally structured the entire network, Leo said, his breathing becoming shallow and fast. I looked at the corporate filings for the offshore shell companies listed in that black ledger you sent me. Every single one of them is legally registered under the exact name Thomas Caldwell. The international bank accounts, the digital signatures, the property lease agreements for the offshore domains. It is all perfectly documented in your name. He used the digital copies of your passport, your social security number, your property deeds, and your lifetime tax records to build this entire criminal empire from the ground up. The floor of the truck seemed to drop completely away. To the federal government, Leo explained desperately, Derek does not even exist on paper. To the cartel leadership, Derek is probably just an anonymous digital employee using an encrypted screen name. But on the official legal paperwork, the absolute kingpin of this entire international laundering operation is you. If the Federal Bureau of Investigation raids that house tomorrow morning, you are going to federal prison for the rest of your natural life. They will seize your home, your pension, and everything you have ever worked for. And if the cartel finds out someone is compromising their node or trying to steal their money, which I suspect Derek is planning to do by using that second mortgage application to fund his escape, they will not look for him. They will trace the paperwork. They will look for the man whose name is on all the accounts. They will look for Thomas Caldwell. They will send a cleanup crew to your house to silence you permanently. Derek has carefully engineered this entire situation to make sure you take the absolute maximum fall, both legally and fatally, while he walks away with millions of dollars in stolen digital currency and your daughter by his side. I sat in the truck, paralyzed by the cold, calculating evil of the man living under my roof. He had smiled at me at the dinner table. He had offered me poisoned tea. He had called me a foolish old man, all while carefully tying a lethal noose around my neck. I am pulling a tactical team together right now, Leo commanded, his agent persona finally breaking through the fear. You stay far away from that house, Dad. We are coming to get him. No, I said softly, my voice suddenly as cold and hard as the steel tools resting in my pocket. If you raid the house now, the cartel will know. They will come for Sarah. I have to go back inside. I have to set the trap myself. I ended the call and tossed the burner phone onto the passenger seat. The drive back was a blur of calculated focus. I coasted my truck silently into its spot near the shed. The pre-dawn air was brutally cold, biting at my face as I retraced my steps across the frost-covered grass. I slipped back through the sliding glass door of the sunroom, locking it silently behind me. The house was exactly as I had left it. The heavy silence felt completely different now. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of a retirement home. It was the holding breath of a live battlefield. I took off my boots, hid my tools, and climbed back into my bed, just as the first pale light of morning began to bleed through the curtains. I closed my eyes and forced my body to rest for exactly 2 hours. A man going into war needs his strength, especially a man who is 78 years old. When the morning sun finally broke through the windows, the real performance began. I walked into the kitchen wearing my usual flannel shirt and poured myself a cup of black coffee. Derek sat at the island furiously typing on his laptop. Sarah was cooking. I offered a tired smile. Good morning, I croaked, selling the illusion of frailty. I slept perfectly. Your herbal tea did the trick, Derek. I did not wake up once. Derek looked up, his eyes flashing arrogant satisfaction. I am glad to hear it, Thomas, he replied smoothly, taking a sip of his orange juice. You should rest as much as you can. We want to make sure your health stays in top condition. The absolute sheer audacity of his fake concern made my stomach churn, but I simply nodded and took a seat at the table. I ate my breakfast, slowly playing the part of the oblivious, grateful father. I watched him kiss my daughter goodbye and tell her he would be working late at the office tonight. I knew exactly what that meant. He was planning to execute his exit strategy. Once his sedan disappeared, Sarah left to run errands. I hugged her and locked the front door. My fragile old man persona instantly vanished. I walked straight to the hallway closet, pulled down the folding attic stairs, and climbed up into the dusty, insulated space above the ceiling. I moved past boxes of old Christmas decorations and family photo albums until I found a heavy steel fireproof document safe tucked in the far corner. I spun the combination lock and opened the heavy lid. Inside, perfectly preserved in thick plastic tubes, were the original architectural blueprints of the house. I had drafted every single line of these schematics myself over 30 years ago. I unrolled the large yellowing sheets of paper on the kitchen island, placing heavy coffee mugs on the corners to keep them flat. I traced my fingers along the foundation lines. When I built this house, I did not just build a standard suburban home. I built a fortress capable of withstanding Category 5 hurricanes and severe civil emergencies. But the systems had not been fully tested in nearly a decade. I walked over to the utility closet and opened the hidden panel located directly behind the main breaker box. Inside was a secondary, entirely independent electrical grid that ran off a massive subterranean diesel generator I had buried in the backyard during the initial construction phase. I flipped the primer switch. Deep below the earth, the heavy engine roared to life with a low, reassuring rumble that sent a steady vibration through the soles of my shoes. The backup power was fully operational and completely isolated from the commercial grid. Derek was currently bleeding dry. Next, I needed to test the perimeter defense. Every single window and exterior door of my house was equipped with industrial-grade reinforced steel hurricane shutters. They were designed to deploy instantly at the push of a panic button, sealing the house inside an impenetrable metal shell. But because Derek had compromised the main smart home network, I could not rely on the digital controls. I had to manually engage the physical override switches. I walked from room to room, carefully removing the decorative wooden trim panels above the window frames to expose the heavy steel gears and the hidden manual tripwires. I lubricated the mechanical tracks with a can of heavy-duty industrial oil, ensuring that when the time came, the metal curtains would drop with absolute terrifying speed. I checked the heavy deadbolts on the exterior doors, reinforcing the strike plates with 3-inch steel screws to make sure no one could kick them in from the outside. The final step of my preparation took me down into the basement. This was the true heart of my trap. The basement was not just a storage space. It was a reinforced panic room. The walls were poured with 12 inches of solid concrete laced with heavy rebar. The door at the top of the stairs was made of solid steel core oak. I spent the last few hours of the afternoon down there routing the manual shutter control wires directly to a heavy industrial switch I had mounted on the concrete wall. I set up a bank of security monitors, linking them to the hidden wired cameras I had installed during construction, completely bypassing Derek and his wireless network entirely. By the time the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the property, the trap was fully set. I sat in a sturdy folding chair in the center of the cold basement, staring at the blank security screens. I was no longer a victim waiting to be slaughtered in his sleep. I was the master of this domain, and I was fully prepared to let the wolves step right into their own iron cage. I just had to wait for the sun to go down. The sun finally went down, plunging the property into a thick, heavy darkness. That brings us exactly back to where this entire nightmare began. I was sitting in the freezing concrete basement, watching the glowing screens of my wired security monitors. Through the infrared cameras mounted outside, I watched the 3 black sports utility vehicles roll silently up my driveway. I watched Derek step out onto the front porch, greeting the armed men in black tactical gear with a confident nod. He pointed directly toward the window of my ground floor bedroom. I watched the men pull the heavy medical-grade body bags from the trunk. My heart beat steadily in my chest, completely devoid of fear. I was perfectly safe inside my reinforced steel and concrete bunker. I leaned closer to the monitor as Derek keyed his security code into the front door keypad and swung the heavy wooden door open, inviting the monsters inside. The 4 hitmen moved with terrifying professional silence. They stepped into the main hallway, their silenced weapons raised and ready. They did not speak a single word to one another. They communicated entirely through small, sharp hand signals. Their heavy combat boots barely made a sound against the polished hardwood floors. Derek walked slightly behind them, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his expensive silk robe. He looked incredibly relaxed, carrying himself with the arrogant swagger of a man who firmly believed he had outsmarted everyone. He believed the poisoned herbal tea had stopped my heart hours ago. He believed he was simply guiding a cleanup crew to dispose of an inconvenient corpse so he could claim my estate. The security camera in the main hallway tracked their movements perfectly as they approached the closed door of my bedroom. The lead assassin, a massive man with cold, dead eyes, gently turned the brass doorknob. He pushed the door open and swept into the dark room, his weapon completely leveled. The other 3 men followed immediately behind him, fanning out across the room to secure the corners. I switched my attention to the camera mounted directly above my bedroom closet. The night vision lens bathed the entire scene in a ghostly green light. Derek confidently stepped into the room and reached for the wall switch. He flicked the lights on, ready to present his grisly prize to the cartel cleaners. But the heavy quilt on my bed was perfectly flat. The pillows were neatly arranged. The mattress was completely empty. Derek froze, his hand still hovering over the light switch. The confident smirk completely vanished from his face, replaced by a look of absolute genuine confusion. He blinked hard as if his eyes were playing tricks on him. He took 2 hesitant steps toward the empty bed, staring at the smooth sheets. "Thomas," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. He turned around and quickly checked the master bathroom. It was empty. He threw open the doors to the walk-in closet. Empty. The sheer panic began to aggressively bubble up inside him. He started pacing frantically around the small room, running his trembling hands through his hair. He looked under the bed. He looked behind the heavy oak dresser. The old man was supposed to be dead. He was supposed to be lying right here. The perfect plan he had spent months crafting was falling apart right in front of his eyes. The 4 cartel assassins did not share his confusion. They shared an immediate, chilling suspicion. In their dark and violent world, when things do not go exactly according to a predetermined plan, it usually means someone is actively setting a trap. The lead hitman slowly lowered his weapon from his shoulder, but he did not engage the safety mechanism. He turned his cold, dead eyes directly toward Derek. "Where is the money?" the massive man asked, his voice a low, threatening gravel that carried clearly through the hidden microphone embedded in my ceiling. Derek stopped pacing and looked at the man, his face draining of all color. "What do you mean?" Derek stammered, holding his hands up defensively. "I do not know where he is." He drank the tea. I watched him drink it. "He should be lying dead right here. I did exactly what I promised your boss." The assassin took a slow, deliberate step toward my son-in-law. "You promised us a body," the man growled, closing the distance between them. "You also promised us that the primary network access keys would be physically resting on this nightstand, but the room is empty. The keys are missing, and you suddenly seem very surprised." Derek backed away until his shoulders hit the wall. "Listen to me, I swear I do not have your money," he pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. The old man must have woken up. He must have wandered off somewhere in the house. The lead assassin did not believe a single word. In the criminal underworld, an empty room and missing hardware wallets only pointed to one logical conclusion. He raised his heavy pistol and pressed the cold steel barrel directly against the center of Derek's forehead. In one synchronized motion, the other 3 men raised their weapons, surrounding him in a tight, lethal circle. They thought my greedy son-in-law had completely double-crossed the Sinaloa cartel. They thought he had successfully transferred the digital funds, hidden the access keys, and brought them here to be ambushed by federal agents. The panic in Derek's eyes was absolutely magnificent to witness. He was no longer the arrogant financial genius. He was just a terrified boy staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. Down in my basement, I took a slow sip of my coffee and watched the iron trap close tightly around his neck. The heavy silence of my home was completely shattered by the muffled, frantic pleas echoing from my bedroom. Down in the basement, the glow of the security monitors painted my face in pale light. I leaned closer to the screen, my hands resting steadily on the cold metal table. The lead assassin kept his weapon firmly pressed against Derek's forehead, the heavy silencer digging deeply into the pale skin. The other three men stood like stone statues, their fingers resting lightly on their triggers. Derek was hyperventilating now, his chest heaving violently under his expensive silk robe. He was desperately trying to explain the unexplainable to men who simply did not care about his pathetic excuses. "I do not have your money," Derek sobbed, his voice echoing loudly through the hidden microphone embedded in my ceiling. The old man was supposed to be dead tonight. He must have done something to the network. He must have moved the hardware ledger. "Please, you have to believe me." The lead hitman did not blink. He was a professional who only dealt in absolute finality. He slowly pulled back the hammer of his heavy pistol. The sharp mechanical click sounded like a thunderclap in the tense, suffocating silence of the room. Before the man could speak his final verdict, a new sound abruptly interrupted the deadly standoff. It was the faint, familiar creak of the floorboards at the far end of the main hallway. The door to the master guest suite slowly swung open. My daughter Sarah had been woken up by the muffled commotion. She stepped out into the dark corridor, wearing her thin cotton pajamas, rubbing the deep sleep from her tired eyes. "Derek," she called out softly, her voice thick with confusion. "Are you out here? Did Dad fall again? Why are all the lights on in his room?" The blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. I watched the security monitor with bated breath, my calloused fingers gripping the edges of the desk, so hard my knuckles ached. Sarah took 3 hesitant steps down the hallway before she finally saw them. She froze instantly, her bare feet rooted permanently to the hardwood floor. Her tired eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror as she took in the terrifying scene unfolding right inside my bedroom. 4 massive men, dressed entirely in black tactical gear, their faces hidden behind dark masks, were standing inside our quiet suburban home with heavy silenced weapons drawn. And right in the center of their deadly circle was her husband, the man she loved and fiercely defended against, my every warning trembling on his knees and crying like a helpless child. For a long, agonizing second, nobody moved. The entire house seemed to hold its breath. The assassins slowly shifted their cold, dead gaze from Derek directly to my daughter standing in the hallway. The lead hitman tilted his heavy head clearly, calculating the value of this unexpected new variable. "Well," he grunted, his deep voice dripping with pure, concentrated menace. "Look what we have here. Maybe you will suddenly remember where our money is if we start asking your pretty wife some very painful questions." That was the exact moment the final fragile illusion of my son-in-law completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. A real man, a loving husband, would have immediately stepped in front of his wife. He would have shielded her from the danger, fought for her life, or begged the armed intruders to leave her out of his own mess. But Derek was not a real man. He was a parasitic, self-serving coward to his absolute core. As the massive hitman took a slow, deliberate step toward the doorway to reach Sarah, Derek scrambled backward frantically on his hands and knees. He lunged desperately toward my daughter, but not to protect her. He grabbed her violently by the shoulders and spun her around by absolute force, pulling her directly in front of his own trembling body. He locked his arms tightly around her waist, physically using my beautiful, terrified daughter as a literal human shield against the cartel guns pointing in their direction. "Please do not shoot me," Derek screamed completely, hiding his face behind her shaking shoulder. "Take her if you have to. I will sign whatever you need. I will give you the house. Take whatever you want from the foolish old man. Just let me walk away from this." Sarah let out a heartbreaking gasp, her entire body shaking with violent sobs. She tried to pull away from his desperate grip, but he held on to her with the manic strength of a terrified animal. "Derek, what are you doing?" she cried out, tears streaming rapidly down her pale cheeks. Who are these men? Why are they here? He completely ignored her desperate questions, continuing to beg the assassins for his own miserable life. He offered them my property, my daughter, and my life, all just to save his own skin. Down in the concrete bunker, I watched this ultimate, unforgivable betrayal unfold on the glowing digital screens. The pain I felt for my daughter in that exact moment was utterly indescribable. I had spent my entire life trying to protect her from the harsh realities of the world, only to have the man she married throw her directly to the wolves. Her heart was breaking in real time, the devastating truth about her perfect husband finally crashing down upon her shoulders. She was sobbing uncontrollably now, realizing that the man holding her was perfectly willing to let her take a bullet meant for him. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold air of the basement fill my lungs. I had seen enough. It was finally time to intervene. The trap I had so carefully constructed was completely primed and ready to spring. I stood in front of the heavy industrial switch mounted securely on the cold concrete wall of my basement. The metal handle was like ice against my calloused palm. On the security monitors, I watched the chaotic scene unfolding in the main hallway upstairs. The lead assassin, realizing my bedroom and the surrounding areas were empty, tightened his grip on his silenced weapon. He glared at Derek, who was still hiding behind my terrified daughter. "If the old man is not in his bedroom," the massive hitman growled, stepping closer to them, "then where exactly is he hiding? You have 5 seconds to tell me before I put a bullet in your wife." Derek did not hesitate. He did not try to negotiate or buy time. He simply raised his trembling hand and pointed a shaking finger directly down the corridor toward the kitchen. "He is down there!" Derek cried out, his voice cracking with terror. "The door next to the pantry leads down to the basement. He spends hours tinkering. He must have gone down when he heard you pull into the driveway." Sarah turned her head and stared at her husband in disbelief. The man she had loved and defended so fiercely against my warnings was now willingly handing her father over to a cartel execution squad just to save himself. The lead assassin sneered in disgust beneath his dark mask. He signaled to 2 of his men with a sharp flick of his wrist. The hitmen immediately broke away from the circle, leaving Derek and Sarah guarded by the remaining gunmen. They moved with swift, lethal purpose down the hallway, their combat boots thudding softly against the hardwood floors. I watched their approach on the kitchen camera. They navigated past the island and stopped directly in front of the plain white door that led down to my basement. To the untrained eye, it looked like a standard door. It had a simple brass knob and was painted to match the surrounding drywall. One of the men reached out and twisted the knob. It did not budge. He jiggled it violently, but the heavy deadbolt held the door firmly in place. He turned to his partner and nodded, stepping back to create enough space to breach the entrance by force. Down in the dark, my face broke into a smile. Those men were killers accustomed to kicking down doors in apartments and tract homes. They fully expected the wood to splinter and the frame to shatter under the focused impact of a heavy combat boot. But they did not know the man who had built this house. When I designed this property 30 years ago, I poured my entire soul and my engineering expertise into every single inch of its foundation. This basement was never meant to be a simple storage area for old holiday decorations or rusty gardening tools. It was meticulously designed to be a self-sustaining panic room, to protect my family from severe natural disasters or armed home invasions. That innocent-looking white door at the top of the stairs was not made of hollow wood. It was actually constructed from a solid 2-inch thick core of hardened steel clad in a decorative oak veneer. The door frame itself was securely anchored directly into the primary concrete load, bearing walls with 6-inch titanium lag bolts. On the digital monitor, I watched the arrogant hitman lift his heavy leg. He threw his entire body weight forward, driving the thick rubber heel of his boot squarely into the exact center of the door, right next to the brass handle. He expected a satisfying crash. He expected the door to fly wide open and reveal the helpless old man cowering at the bottom of the wooden stairs. Instead, a dull bone-jarring thud echoed loudly through the kitchen. The steel core door did not even flex. It did not budge a single millimeter, but the violent kinetic energy of the kick reverberated straight back up the assassin's leg. The man let out a sharp cry of sudden agony, stumbling backward and dropping to one knee. He grabbed his shins, swearing loudly in Spanish. His partner stared at the white door in absolute disbelief. He raised his silenced weapon, aiming directly at the deadbolt, preparing to shoot the locking mechanism out of the heavy frame. They were starting to realize that they were not dealing with a fragile retiree hiding in a dusty cellar. The lead hitman, hearing the commotion from the kitchen, dragged Derek and Sarah violently down the hallway to see what was causing the delay. When he saw his injured man kneeling on the floor and the door intact, his dark eyes narrowed in realization. "This is not a normal door," the lead assassin muttered, running his gloved hand carefully over the smooth surface. "Get the breaching charges from the truck. We are going to blow the frame right out of the wall." He turned his furious gaze back to Derek. "What else did you fail to mention about this house, you liar?" Derek shook his head, his face pale, babbling incomprehensible apologies as Sarah wept beside him. They thought they still had the upper hand. They thought they were the predators trying to dig a trapped animal out of its burrow. But they were looking at the situation backward. I was not trapped down here with them. They were trapped up there with me. I took one final look at the monitors, memorizing the terrified face of my son-in-law. I tightly gripped the cold handle of the industrial switch. With one downward motion, I pulled the heavy lever down. A loud mechanical clank echoed through the concrete bunker as the primary electrical contactors slammed shut, sending a massive surge of raw power straight into the hidden nervous system of the entire house, instantly activating every single hidden defense mechanism that I had spent years carefully building and perfecting in secret. The moment the heavy copper contacts of the industrial switch slammed together, the entire house came alive with a deafening mechanical roar. Deep beneath the frost-covered soil of the backyard, the massive diesel generator I had buried 3 decades ago kicked into absolute overdrive. It bypassed the commercial electrical grid, entirely flooding the hidden nervous system of the property with raw, uninterrupted power. A blinding pulse of red emergency light washed through the basement, and simultaneously the high-decibel internal security sirens began to scream. The sound was not a simple burglar alarm. It was an ear-splitting, disorienting industrial wail designed to shatter the concentration and completely overwhelm the senses of anyone standing on the ground floor. On the security monitors, I watched the immediate violent reaction of the men standing in my hallway. The sudden piercing blast of the sirens hit them like a physical wall. The lead assassin dropped his weapon to his side and instinctively clamped both of his gloved hands over his ears, his face twisting in genuine agony. Derek stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of an expensive Persian rug and collapsing heavily onto the hardwood floor. Sarah let out a scream, though the sound was swallowed by the overwhelming noise of the alarm. But the deafening siren was only the very first layer of the trap. The true defense mechanism was just beginning to deploy. Hidden inside the thick wooden headers above every single window and exterior door of the house, heavy steel gears engaged with a violent metallic grinding noise. I had meticulously lubricated the tracks just a few hours earlier, ensuring there would be absolutely no friction to slow them down. With a terrifying synchronized crash, the reinforced steel hurricane shutters dropped from their concealed housings. These were not the flimsy aluminum slats you buy at a local hardware store. They were solid, quarter-inch thick interlocking steel plates, designed to deflect flying debris in a Category 5 storm. They slammed down over the large living room windows, plunging the space into immediate darkness, save for the flashing red emergency strobes. They dropped heavily over the sliding glass doors of the sunroom, the kitchen windows, and the master bedroom. When the heavy steel curtains hit the bottom of their metal tracks, specialized industrial locking pins automatically fired outward, anchoring the shutters deep into the solid concrete foundation of the house. The sound was incredibly distinctive, a rapid succession of heavy metallic thuds echoing through the floors. At the exact same moment, the reinforced electronic deadbolts on the front and back doors snapped shut with absolute unforgiving finality. The magnetic locks engaged, sealing the heavy exterior doors with thousands of pounds of holding force. In a matter of mere seconds, the quiet, welcoming suburban home I had built for my family had completely transformed into a sealed, impenetrable steel vault. The sudden darkness and flashing red lights threw the cartel hitmen into a state of absolute chaos. They were professional killers trained to strike quickly and fade into the night. They were not equipped for a prolonged siege, and they certainly were not prepared to be locked inside a fortified bunker. The lead assassin, recovering from the initial shock of the sirens, grabbed his radio and began shouting orders in Spanish to his men. The two hitmen, who had been trying to kick down my basement door, immediately abandoned their futile effort. They sprinted down the hallway toward the front entrance, their heavy boots slipping on the polished wood. One of the men grabbed the brass handle of the front door and pulled with all of his massive strength. It did not yield a single fraction of an inch. He kicked the heavy oak wood, but the reinforced strike plates and the engaged magnetic locks held it perfectly rigid. Panic finally began to crack through their cold, professional facades. The other hitman raised his silenced weapon and pointed it directly at the large living room window, completely forgetting about the steel barrier that had just dropped into place. He pulled the trigger 3 times in rapid succession. The muffled gunshots echoed in the confined space, but the bullets simply flattened against the thick steel plates of the hurricane shutters, ricocheting harmlessly into the drywall. There was no glass shattering. There was no escape route opening up into the cold night air. They were completely and utterly trapped. Derek was still cowering on the floor, his hands desperately covering his head. The flashing red strobe lights painted his pale, terrified face in sinister flashes. He stared at the heavy steel shutters covering the windows, his mind struggling to process the impossible reality of his situation. He had spent the last 3 years treating me like a naive, foolish old man. He had smirked at my warnings, dismissed my concerns, and planned to use my home as the staging ground for his criminal enterprise. He honestly believed he held all the cards. But as he looked around at the sealed metal tomb he was currently sitting inside, the devastating truth finally washed over him. He had not outsmarted anyone. He had willingly walked his violent associates straight into an inescapable cage, and he had handed the only key directly to the man he was trying to kill. Sarah remained frozen against the hallway wall, her hands pressed tightly over her ears to block out the blaring sirens. Her tear-filled eyes darted between the trapped cartel assassins and her sobbing husband. The profound realization of my engineering capabilities was dawning on her. She finally understood that her father was not a helpless victim waiting to be rescued. Sitting in the cold, quiet sanctuary of my concrete basement, I watched the absolute terror unfolding on the digital screens above. The transition of power was now entirely complete. The predators who had come to hunt me were now nothing more than desperate trapped animals, and I was the absolute warden of this inescapable steel prison. I reached across the cold metal table and rested my fingers on the heavy black microphone of the internal communication system. I looked at the security monitors. The cartel hitmen were pacing the hallway like caged predators, while Derek remained on the floor, trembling violently in the flashing red emergency light. I flipped the secondary toggle switch on the control panel, killing the deafening security sirens on the ground floor. The sudden absolute silence that fell over the house was almost as disorienting as the blaring alarm had been. The men upstairs froze in their tracks, their heavy weapons raised, scanning the dark ceiling for the source of the sudden quiet. I pressed the transmission button firmly. "Good evening, gentlemen," I said. My voice carried through the hidden ceiling speakers in every single room of the house. It did not shake. It did not waver. It resonated with the calm, cold authority of a man holding a loaded gun. Derek gasped loudly, his head snapping upward to stare blindly at the ceiling. "Thomas," he shouted, his voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. "Thomas, where are you? Turn these lights back on and open the front door right now." The lead assassin stepped forward, his dark eyes darting around the hallway. He realized they were dealing with a ghost in the walls. Derek scrambled to his feet, leaning heavily against the wall for support. He looked directly into the lens of the hallway security camera, finally understanding that I was watching his every single move. "You crazy old fool," Derek screamed, pointing a shaking finger at the small glass dome of the camera. "What do you think you are doing? You cannot keep us locked in here. These men are not playing games. They will tear this house apart brick by brick until they find you. Open the steel shutters right now and let us walk out of here, or I swear to God, I will make you deeply regret it." I sat back in my folding chair, watching the pathetic display of false bravado. He was trying to act tough in front of the cartel killers, desperately hoping to regain some fraction of control. But his trembling knees and the sweat pouring down his pale face told a completely different story. I pressed the transmission button again. "You are not in a position to make demands, Derek," I replied smoothly. "You brought armed killers into my home. You tried to poison me with your herbal tea. You tried to frame me for your international money laundering operation. Did you really think I would just quietly go to sleep and let you steal my life?" Derek's eyes widened in sheer panic. He quickly glanced over his shoulder at the massive lead hitman, who was now staring at Derek with an expression of pure, concentrated fury. The hitman stepped closer, the heavy silencer of his weapon brushing against Derek's chest. Derek swallowed hard, his breathing becoming shallow and frantic. He knew his lies were entirely exposed. He had to play his final, most despicable card. "Listen to me very carefully, Thomas." Derek yelled, his voice echoing loudly in the silent hallway. "If you do not press the button to lift those steel shutters this exact second, I will give your precious daughter to these men. I will tell them to do whatever they want with her. I will not lift a single finger to stop them. You love her too much to let her get hurt. Open the doors, or her blood is entirely on your hands." The sheer depravity of his threat hung heavily in the cold air of the house. I shifted my gaze to the camera showing Sarah. She was standing just a few feet away from him, her back pressed tightly against the floral wallpaper. She was staring at her husband with an expression of absolute, unadulterated horror. The man who had promised to love her, honor her, and protect her in sickness and in health was now actively offering her up as a sacrifice to a drug cartel execution squad simply to buy himself a few more minutes of life. Derek did not even look at her when he said it. He did not offer her a glance of apology or regret. He kept his desperate eyes fixed firmly on the ceiling camera, waiting for my fatherly instincts to break under the immense pressure of his terrifying threat. Sarah let out a broken, agonizing sob. She slowly slid down the wall until she was sitting on the hardwood floor, pulling her knees tightly to her chest. The final lingering illusion of her perfect marriage shattered completely. The charming, ambitious financial advisor she had fiercely defended against my warnings was completely gone. In his place stood a cowardly, selfish monster who viewed her as nothing more than a convenient bargaining chip. I felt a sharp ache in my chest for the immense pain my daughter was experiencing in that moment. But I also knew that yielding to a terrorist was not an option. If I opened those doors, the cartel would kill us all to eliminate the witnesses. I had to remain entirely ice cold. I pressed the button on the microphone one more time. "You are a pathetic excuse for a man, Derek," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a razor blade. "You think you can use my daughter to force my hand. But you have fundamentally misunderstood the situation. I am not negotiating with you. You have absolutely nothing to offer me, and you have absolutely nothing to offer the dangerous men standing right behind you. You told them I was dead. You told them you had the digital access keys to their money. You lied to them, Derek. And in their line of business, I do not think they forgive liars very easily." I released the button and leaned back, watching the screens intently. I had laid all the cards out on the table. I had explicitly highlighted Derek's absolute uselessness to the armed men holding him captive. The lead hitman slowly lowered his weapon from Derek's chest. He turned his head slightly, making eye contact with the other 3 assassins in the hallway. A silent, lethal understanding passed between them. Derek's value as an insider was gone. His leverage was gone. He was no longer an asset to the Sinaloa cartel. He was a liability who had locked them inside a steel trap. Derek looked at the hitman, his face draining of whatever color it had left. He finally realized that the threat was no longer coming from the ceiling speakers. The true danger was standing right next to him. I kept my hand firmly pressed against the cold transmission button of the intercom. I did not spare another glance at the pathetic, trembling figure of my son-in-law. Derek had made his choice when he offered my daughter to a firing squad. He had crossed a line that completely erased any lingering shred of mercy I might have held in my heart. Now it was time to let the natural order of the criminal underworld take its course. I shifted my focus entirely away from Derek and addressed the masked men who were currently holding him captive. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice echoing evenly through the high-fidelity speakers mounted in the ceiling. "I know exactly who you are, and I know exactly who you work for now. I know about the massive server farm running in my attached garage, and I know about the millions of dollars in digital currency your organization has been actively laundering through this suburban house." The lead hitman slowly turned his masked face upward, staring intently at the nearest security camera. His dark eyes narrowed, registering the fact that the foolish old man they were sent to assassinate was actually completely aware of their highly classified operation. Derek let out a weak, desperate whimper, shaking his head frantically, but he was too terrified to speak. I continued speaking, ensuring every single word landed with the heavy, devastating impact of a sledgehammer. "You were sent here tonight to clean up a mess," I explained calmly. "Derek told your superiors that I was becoming suspicious. He told you that I was a liability who needed to be permanently silenced so your operation could continue without interruption. But that was a complete lie. Derek did not invite you here tonight to protect the cartel. He invited you here so you could do his dirty work, leaving his hands completely clean while he executed his actual plan." The three other assassins slowly closed the circle around Derek, their silenced weapons lowering slightly from their firing positions, but their posture radiating a new, highly focused hostility. Derek raised his trembling hands, trying to back away, but there was nowhere left for him to run. "Your ambitious inside man got greedy," I announced, letting the cold truth saturate the silent hallway. "He took out a fraudulent second mortgage on my property for $450,000 just yesterday. He planned to use that money to fund his immediate escape. He was going to let you kill me, and then, while you were busy disposing of my body in those heavy medical bags you brought, he was going to take the encrypted hardware wallets hidden in his steel lockbox. He was going to steal your millions, pack his bags, and disappear into the wind." "No!" Derek shrieked, his voice breaking into a pathetic sob. "That is a lie. He is lying to you. I would never steal from the organization. I swear on my life I was just trying to protect the network." The lead assassin suddenly stepped forward and struck Derek violently across the face with the heavy steel grip of his pistol. The sickening crunch of breaking cartilage echoed loudly through the microphone. Derek collapsed onto the hardwood floor, clutching his shattered nose, blood pouring through his trembling fingers. Sarah let out a muffled scream and pressed herself tighter against the wall, but the hitmen completely ignored her. Their attention was now entirely focused on the bleeding traitor sobbing at their feet. I watched the brutal strike on the monitor, my expression completely unchanged. I leaned closer to the microphone, ready to deliver the final crushing blow. "You do not have to believe me," I said smoothly. "But you should ask yourselves why the heavy steel lockbox hidden on his workbench in the garage is completely empty right now. I picked the lock hours ago. I took the 5 encrypted hardware wallets, and I took the black leather ledger containing all of your offshore shell companies and international routing numbers." Derek looked up from the floor, his face covered in blood, his eyes wide with absolute genuine horror. He finally realized the full extent of my counterattack. He realized that I had not just locked him inside the house, but I had completely dismantled his entire criminal empire while he was sleeping down the hall. I have some very bad news for you, gentlemen, I continued, my voice dropping into a low, uncompromising register. 10 minutes before you rolled up my driveway, I established a secure, encrypted connection with my adopted son. He is a senior cybercrimes agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Washington. I transferred every single photograph, every single routing number, and the master access keys to your entire digital fortune directly to his federal database. The heavy silence that followed that statement was absolutely deafening. The cartel assassins froze, processing the catastrophic magnitude of what I had just revealed. The money was gone. The network was exposed. The feds already had the keys. Derek has absolutely nothing left to give you, I stated coldly. He has no money, he has no leverage, and he has no way out of this house. He lied to you, he tried to steal from you, and he is the sole reason you are currently locked inside a steel vault, waiting for the authorities to arrive. I am going to turn off the intercom now. I suggest you spend your remaining time dealing with the man who betrayed you. I lifted my finger from the transmission button, cutting the microphone feed. I leaned back in my folding chair and took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I had completely removed myself from the equation. I had successfully borrowed their incredibly sharp knife to execute my revenge without ever having to dirty my own hands. I watched the screens as the wolves slowly turned their attention to the bleeding lamb thrashing on the floor. The heavy silence that followed the click of the intercom was suffocating. On the digital monitors, the scene upstairs transformed into a terrifying display of raw, unrestrained consequence. The 4 cartel assassins did not exchange any further words. They did not need to. The massive lead hitman reached down with his gloved hands and grabbed the collar of Derek's expensive silk robe. With a violent, effortless jerk, he hauled my son-in-law up from the hardwood floor. Derek's feet scrambled desperately against the polished wood, trying to find traction, but the hitman dragged him backward down the hallway with terrifying ease. They moved him out of the narrow corridor and directly into the center of the spacious living room, casting him onto the expensive Persian rug like a piece of discarded garbage. Derek rolled onto his back, coughing and spitting blood from his shattered nose. He held his trembling hands up in front of his face, pleading with a voice that was barely recognizable. "Please, you have to listen to me," he begged, tears streaming down his bruised cheeks. "We can still fix this. I can call the bank. I can get the mortgage money transferred directly to your accounts. Just give me my phone." The lead assassin did not even bother to answer the pathetic negotiation. He simply stepped forward and delivered a devastating, crushing kick directly to Derek's ribs. The sickening crack of bone echoed through the hidden microphones, followed instantly by a high-pitched, agonizing scream that tore through the quiet house. The other 3 hitmen joined the assault, their cold professionalism replaced by a furious, vengeful rage. They had been compromised, trapped, and betrayed by the coward writhing at their feet. They unleashed their fury with calculated, brutal precision. A heavy combat boot slammed into Derek's stomach, forcing the air out of his lungs in a sharp, gasping wheeze. Another assassin grabbed a heavy brass lamp from the end table and brought the heavy base crashing down across Derek's shoulders. The expensive living room furniture I had purchased for them was completely destroyed in the chaotic violence. The glass coffee table shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces as Derek was thrown violently against it. His manicured hands, the same hands he used to type fraudulent loan documents and steal my identity, were pinned beneath the heavy boots of the cartel enforcers. In the far corner of the room, pressed tightly against the floral wallpaper of the hallway threshold, my daughter Sarah watched the entire nightmare unfold. She had slid down to the floor, wrapping her arms tightly around her knees, making herself as small as humanly possible. The flashing red strobe lights of the emergency alarm illuminated her pale, tear-stained face in intermittent bursts of terrifying color. For 3 long years, she had fiercely defended the man currently screaming on the floor. She had accused me of being a paranoid, jealous old man who simply could not accept her husband's brilliant ambition. She had believed every single one of his charming lies, blinding herself to the toxic, parasitic nature of his true character. But as she sat there trembling in the dark, The blindfold was finally and violently ripped away from her eyes. She was not watching a brilliant financial mind being victimized. She was watching a cowardly criminal suffering the direct consequences of his own monumental greed. The illusion of her perfect marriage was completely dead, beaten to a bloody pulp on the living room rug. The man who had promised to protect her had offered her up to these very killers just moments ago to save his own miserable life. Sarah pressed her hands firmly over her ears, trying to block out the horrific sounds of his screams and the sickening thuds of the physical blows, but she could not look away. The devastating realization washed over her like a freezing tidal wave. Her father had been absolutely right all along. Every warning, every intuition, every attempt I made to protect her had been the absolute truth. Down in the cold, heavily fortified concrete basement, I remained seated in my simple folding chair. The air down here was calm, completely isolated from the violent storm raging just a few feet above my head. I reached out and picked up my ceramic mug from the metal desk. The coffee was still pleasantly warm. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the dark, bitter liquid coat my throat. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the man being dismantled on my monitors. Some might call it cruel for a father to sit and watch such violence unfold inside his own home, but I am an engineer. I understand that when a dangerous, destructive element threatens the structural integrity of a foundation, it must be completely and ruthlessly eradicated before the entire building collapses. Derek was a parasite feeding on my wealth, my daughter's love, and my hard-earned security. He planned to steal my home, frame me for international money laundering, and leave me dead inside. He had brought these wolves to my door. I simply stepped aside and let the wolves do what they do best. The flashing screens bathed my face in a pale, shifting light as I watched the hitmen lift Derek from the ruined floor one more time. His custom-tailored navy blue suit was completely shredded and soaked in his own blood. He was no longer screaming. He was just letting out weak, pathetic moans, his body completely broken by the merciless assault. The lead assassin grabbed Derek by the throat, pinning him forcefully against the drywall. He pressed the heavy, silenced barrel of his pistol directly underneath Derek's jaw, preparing to deliver the final fatal judgment of the Sinaloa cartel. I rested my ceramic coffee mug gently on the cold metal desk. I folded my hands and watched the digital screens closely, patiently waiting in the dark for the inevitable end of his miserable existence. The finger of the lead assassin tightened slowly around the curved metal trigger of his silenced weapon. The pressure was smooth, practiced, and completely devoid of any human hesitation. Pinned against the ruined drywall of the living room, Derek squeezed his eyes shut. A pathetic, whimpering sound escaped his bloodied lips as he braced himself for the absolute final moment of his life. In the hallway, Sarah buried her face deeply into her knees, unable to watch the violent end of the man she had once called her husband. Down in the concrete safety of the basement, I did not look away from the glowing security monitors. I watched his right hand, fully prepared to witness the brutal consequence of this monumental greed. But before the heavy firing pin could strike, a strange, deep vibration began to ripple through the foundation of the house. It started as a subtle hum, barely noticeable beneath the chaotic sounds of the living room. I looked down at my ceramic mug resting on the metal desk. The dark surface of the coffee was trembling, sending tiny concentric ripples outward to the edges of the cup. Within 3 seconds, that subtle hum aggressively escalated into a massive, deafening roar. The entire house began to shake violently. Fine white dust from the drywall ceiling drifted down onto the monitors. The heavy, rhythmic chopping sound of military-grade rotor blades cut through the cold autumn night, hovering directly over the roof of my property. The lead hitman froze, his finger still resting heavily on the trigger. He snapped his head toward the ceiling, his dark eyes widening in sudden realization. He lowered his weapon slightly, the professional composure of a seasoned cartel enforcer suddenly fracturing. The 3 other assassins in the room instantly backed away from the broken body of Derek. They raised their rifles, spinning in frantic circles, aiming at the ceiling, the walls, and the reinforced doors. They were trapped inside a steel box, and the overwhelming force of the federal government had just descended directly onto the lid. Through the microscopic gaps and ventilation slits of the heavy steel hurricane shutters covering the living room windows, blinding beams of intense light began to pierce the darkness. Brilliant flashes of aggressive red and piercing blue swept across the walls in a dizzying, chaotic rhythm. The piercing wail of police sirens joined the deafening roar of the helicopters outside, creating a terrifying symphony of inescapable justice. The neighborhood that Derek thought was quiet and isolated was now completely locked down, surrounded by dozens of heavily armed federal agents. The lead assassin dropped Derek completely. The broken financial advisor slumped to the floor, like a discarded rag doll, gasping for air and clutching his bleeding throat. The hitman shouted desperate orders in Spanish, directing his men to find cover, but there was nowhere to hide. They had brought silenced pistols and light tactical gear to execute a quiet assassination. They were entirely unprepared to face the devastating, overwhelming firepower of a fully mobilized tactical team. Down in the bunker, a small green light blinked rapidly on my secure burner phone. It was a single one-word text message from Leo. The message simply read, "Now." It was the exact signal we had previously agreed upon. I reached across the metal desk and grabbed the heavy manual override lever for the property defense grid. The cartel men had served their necessary purpose. They had exposed the true nature of Derek to my daughter and delivered the physical punishment he so richly deserved. It was time to let the real authorities finish the job. I pulled the heavy lever upward. The deafening mechanical grinding of the heavy steel gears echoed once again through the walls of the house. The reinforced hurricane shutters covering the front and back doors began to slowly retract into their wooden housings, rolling upward to expose the glass and wood beneath. At the exact same moment, I flipped the primary electrical switch, completely disengaging the thousands of pounds of holding force, keeping the magnetic deadbolts locked. The front door was suddenly vulnerable. The breach was absolutely instantaneous and perfectly synchronized. Before the steel shutters had even fully retracted into the ceiling, a massive explosive breaching charge detonated against the front door. The heavy oak wood blew completely inward, splintering into 1,000 jagged pieces that flew across the hallway. A thick, choking cloud of gray chemical smoke poured into the house. Simultaneously, a deafening crash echoed from the kitchen as a secondary tactical team smashed through the sliding glass doors of the sunroom, completely surrounding the living room from both sides. Dozens of heavily armored tactical officers poured through the shattered entrances, moving with terrifying fluid precision. They carried heavy ballistic shields and high-powered assault rifles equipped with blinding tactical flashlights. The intense beams of white light cut aggressively through the smoke, illuminating the terrified faces of the cartel assassins. "Federal agents, drop your weapons immediately," a booming, mechanically amplified voice echoed through the chaotic living room. "Get on the ground right now, or you will be neutralized." The cartel hitmen were ruthless killers, but they were not suicidal. They took one look at the overwhelming wall of federal armor and laser sights aimed directly at their chests, and the fight completely drained out of them. The lead assassin slowly lowered his heavy pistol to the ruined Persian rug, raising his gloved hands high into the air. The other 3 men quickly followed his example, dropping to their knees and lacing their fingers behind their heads. Tactical officers swarmed them instantly, forcing them flat onto their stomachs and securing their wrists with heavy plastic zip ties. The massive threat of the Sinaloa cartel was completely neutralized in less than 60 seconds. Through the thick smoke of the breached entrance, a familiar figure stepped confidently into the living room. It was Leo. He wore a heavy tactical vest adorned with bold yellow letters reading FBI. He stood tall amidst the swirling gray chemical smoke, his sharp eyes scanning the chaotic destruction of my living room. The tactical officers moved with incredible efficiency around him, hauling the 4 subdued cartel hitmen to their feet. The heavy plastic zip ties cut deeply into the wrists of the assassins, their faces pressed firmly against the ruined drywall, as they were thoroughly searched for hidden weapons. The lead hitman, the massive man who had been just seconds away from pulling the trigger, shot a venomous glare toward the center of the room before an agent aggressively shoved him toward the shattered front doorway. In less than a minute, the deadly predators who had confidently marched into my home were dragged out into the flashing red and blue lights of the front lawn, reduced to nothing more than federal prisoners facing multiple life sentences. The deafening roar of the helicopters outside slowly began to fade as the pilots pulled back, transitioning from an active breach pattern to a standard aerial perimeter watch. The immediate lethal threat to my life was finally over. I took a deep breath of the cold, damp air filtering down into the basement, letting the tense muscles in my shoulders finally relax. I stood up from the metal folding chair, smoothed out the wrinkles in my flannel shirt, and slowly walked up the wooden stairs toward the kitchen door. I pushed the heavy steel core door open and stepped out into the chaotic aftermath of the raid. The main hallway was a complete disaster zone. Shattered wood, broken glass, and overturned furniture littered the polished hardwood floors. A thick layer of white drywall dust covered every surface, completely ruining the expensive Persian rugs. Two heavily armored federal agents were currently standing over the broken, bleeding form of my son-in-law. Derek was a pitiful sight to behold. His custom-tailored navy blue suit was torn into bloody rags, and his face was swollen into a horrific mosaic of dark purple bruises. The agents grabbed him by the arms, hauling his limp body upward without a single ounce of gentleness. They wrenched his arms behind his back, securing his wrists tightly with heavy steel handcuffs that clicked loudly in the tense silence of the room. Derek groaned in absolute agony, his shattered ribs shifting painfully under the firm grip of the tactical officers. As they spun him around to march him toward the ruined front entrance, his swollen, bloodshot eyes locked directly onto mine. He saw me standing calmly in the doorway of the kitchen, completely unharmed, surveying the wreckage of the trap I had so carefully engineered for him. The realization of his total, absolute defeat finally washed over his battered face. The arrogant financial genius who had plotted to steal my home and frame me for international money laundering was completely gone. He was nothing but a desperate, broken coward, facing decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Thomas, he choked out his voice, a wet, pathetic gargle. Thomas, please. You have to tell them I was forced into this. You have to tell them the cartel made me do it. I am your family. Please do not let them take me away. He tried to drag his feet violently, resisting the federal agents who were pulling him toward the door, but his broken body simply lacked the necessary strength. I did not move a single muscle. I stood there with my hands resting casually in my pockets, looking at him with absolute unfiltered disgust. You are not my family. Derek, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the smoke-filled hallway. You are a parasite who tried to feed on the people who gave you shelter. You invited armed killers into this house to murder me, and you threw my only daughter directly into their line of fire to save your own miserable skin. You made your choices, and now you will live with the consequences. I hope you enjoy your new concrete cell, because it is the only home you will ever have for the rest of your natural life. Derek let out a harrowing, desperate sob, turning his bleeding face toward the far corner of the living room, where Sarah was still huddled against the wall. Sarah, please, he begged, tears mixing with the blood pouring from his shattered nose. Tell them I love you. Tell them I was trying to protect our future. But my daughter did not move to help him. She slowly raised her head, looking at the man she had fiercely defended for 3 long years. Her face was incredibly pale, but the tears had completely stopped falling. The profound devastation in her eyes had slowly hardened into a cold, unbreakable realization. She finally saw the true monster hiding beneath the expensive suits and the charming lies. She turned her face away, refusing to acknowledge his pathetic pleas, completely severing the emotional bond that had tied her to him. The federal agents jerked Derek forward, dragging him forcefully through the shattered doorframe and out into the freezing autumn night. The heavy doors of an armored transport van slammed shut, swallowing his screams entirely. I watched the transport van roll down the gravel driveway. Heavy footsteps approached from the living room. Leo walked up to me, pulling the tactical helmet from his head and letting out a long, exhausted sigh. He looked at the wreckage of the hallway, then turned his dark, intense eyes to me. "We secured the access keys," he said quietly. "The entire laundering node is dismantled, Dad. You crippled a massive syndicate from your basement." I offered him a tired, genuine smile. "I had excellent motivation," I replied softly. Leo stepped forward, wrapping his strong arms around my shoulders in a firm embrace. "I am just glad you are safe," he whispered. "You did a good job tonight." I hugged my adopted son tightly, feeling the crushing weight of the terrifying night finally lift. Several weeks have passed since the terrifying night. The federal tactical teams breached my front door and dragged the monsters out of my home. The shattered wood of the entrance has been completely replaced by a beautiful, solid mahogany frame. The damaged drywall is repaired, the ruined carpets are gone, and the heavy steel hurricane shutters are safely tucked away in their wooden housings. The house is quiet again, but the silence is no longer heavy or suffocating. It is the deep, genuine peace of a hard-fought victory. The federal prosecutors did not offer Derek any lenient deals. With the mountain of irrefutable digital evidence I provided through Leo, the court system moved with devastating speed. My former son-in-law is currently sitting in a maximum security federal penitentiary, awaiting a formal sentencing that will guarantee him at least 45 years behind bars, without the possibility of parole. And because the cartel knows exactly who compromised their massive laundering network, Derek spends every single day locked in solitary confinement, terrified of his own shadow. He has lost his freedom, his fake wealth, and his arrogant pride. Yesterday afternoon, I was sitting on the back porch when a familiar car pulled into the driveway. It was Sarah. She walked slowly up the wooden steps, looking completely exhausted and deeply broken. She wore a simple gray sweater, her shoulders slumped beneath the heavy weight of her shattered reality. She did not have a key anymore, because I had permanently changed all the locks the morning after the raid. I walked to the door, opening it before she could knock. When she saw me, her eyes immediately filled with tears. She reached out desperately, wanting to fall into my arms and hide from the harsh consequences of the world. "Dad," she cried, her voice trembling with profound regret. "I am so sorry. I was so blind. I have nowhere else to go. The bank froze our joint accounts and the apartment we tried to rent fell through. Please let me move back into the guest room, just until I can get back on my feet. I promise I will make it up to you. I will take care of you." I looked quietly at my daughter. My heart physically ached for the pain she was experiencing. Every natural fatherly instinct inside of me screamed to open the door, wrap her in a warm embrace, and tell her that everything was going to be perfectly fine. But I am an old construction engineer. I know that if you build a house on a weak foundation, it will inevitably collapse the moment a storm hits. For her entire life, I had been her foundation. I had protected her from every hardship and sheltered her from reality. And because I had made her life so incredibly easy, she grew up lacking the necessary strength to recognize a predator when he walked right into our lives. She had chosen to blindly follow a parasitic liar, fiercely defending him while he actively plotted to steal my home and end my life. I did not step aside to let her in. Instead, I reached behind the door and pulled out a large, heavy suitcase containing the rest of her personal belongings. I set it gently on the front porch. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small white envelope. Inside was a check for $10,000. I handed it to her. She looked down at the envelope, her tear-filled eyes widening in confusion. "Sarah." I said, my voice incredibly soft, but entirely unyielding. "I love you. You are my flesh and blood. But you chose that man over your own father. You defended his lies, and when the absolute worst happened, you saw exactly how little he cared about your safety. It is time you finally learned to survive on your own. You need to learn how the real world works without my money and my roof protecting you from the consequences of your choices. Use this money to rent a small apartment and buy groceries. Get a job. Build your own life. But you cannot stay here anymore." She stared at me in absolute shock, the tears streaming freely down her pale cheeks. She opened her mouth to argue, to beg for another chance, but she saw the iron resolution in my eyes. She slowly reached out and took the envelope. She grabbed the handle of the suitcase, turned around, and walked back down the driveway. I stood on the porch and watched her drive away. It was the hardest thing I have ever done in my 78 years of life, but it was absolutely necessary for her survival. This morning I drove into town and sat down with my estate lawyer. I officially changed my last will. I placed a small, untouchable trust fund aside for Sarah, just enough to ensure she will never end up homeless if she truly fails, but she will not inherit my primary estate. The house I built with my own hands, my savings and my true legacy, are now legally transferred to Leo. Blood does not automatically make someone family. Loyalty, respect, and unconditional love are the true building blocks of a home. Leo earned his place in my heart, and he proved his devotion when my life was on the line. Sometimes doing the right thing for the people you love requires an immense amount of painful discipline. You cannot save people from the fires they help start. You can only give them the tools to rebuild from the ashes. Thank you for listening to my story. Did I go too far by throwing Sarah out and forcing her to face reality? Let me know in the comments below. If you found value in my journey, please subscribe to the channel. Remember, true family protects you from the wolves they do not invite them inside. See you in the next story.